10 April 1993. South Africa was only 1 year away from its first democratic election. Apartheid was beginning to collapse. Nelson Mandela had been released. Political negotiations were underway. For the first time in decades, millions of South Africans could see the possibility of a democratic future. But then, on a quiet Saturday morning in Bosberg, a gunman walked up to the home of one of the most popular political figures in the country at that time. His name was Chris Hani. Two shots changed South Africa's history forever. But the story of Chris Hani did not begin with the bullets, and it did not end with his death. Because to understand why his assassination shocked an entire nation, you first have to understand who Chris Hani really was. Chris Hani was born Thembesihle Hani on 28 June 1942 in Tabalele in the Kofi-Mbamba region of Eastern Cape. He was the fifth of 6 children. His family knew poverty. His father, Gabriel Hani, was forced to leave the rural home in search of work. His mother, Mary, was left to manage the household. For the young Hani, inequality wasn't something he learned from a textbook. He witnessed it. He lived it. And those experiences eventually shaped the political man he became. Hani grew up deeply influenced by Christianity. But as he grew older, another influence entered his life: politics. At Fourth Harare University, Hani encountered ideas that changed the racial and economic order of apartheid South Africa. He began studying the system around him. Why were black South Africans denied political power? Why were communities deliberately kept poor? Why could one race possess privileges that another was systematically denied? The questions became impossible for him to ignore, and eventually Hani made a decision that would determine the rest of his life. He would fight the system.
I want to be honest. I was annoyed. I was marooned in the Transkei when the decision was taken to suspend Amstrad. My indemnity had been withdrawn. I had spent more than 27 years in MK. I'd spent the best part of my life in an armed struggle against this regime. I was angry and bitter that this decision was taken without comprehensive consultation. That was my immediate gut feeling. I didn't sleep when our delegation was locked with de Klerk negotiating. I was waiting for the outcome. When there was that press conference early in the morning announcing the suspension of military activities, I felt like crying. I'm one of the people who have seen comrades dying, both inside the country and outside the country, in the struggle against the regime of terror in Pretoria. I know the names, I know the faces. I know how these young people put aside everything in life to concentrate in the fight against white domination. And I said to myself, probably this was the right decision. But why was it that there was no widespread consultation with those who were actually involved in the physical side of armed struggle? That was my initial reaction. But like a disciplined soldier, a disciplined member of the movement, the decision had been taken. I had to understand this decision. And when it was explained that it was important to maintain the momentum of negotiations, I was ready to be reined in to explain it to other comrades. And I did it. Because in a movement as big as ours, sometimes you've got to subject your own strong personal views and accept the views of the majority in the leadership.
In 1961, Hani joined the underground South African Communist Party. A year later, he became one of the early volunteers of Umkhonto Wesizwe, the armed wing of the African National Congress. He wasn't simply a politician. He was willing to become a soldier. But there was a problem. The apartheid state was hunting people like him. In 1962, Hani was arrested after police discovered political pamphlets in his possessions. He was charged under apartheid's anti-communist laws. He was imprisoned. Later, while out of bail, he went underground and eventually he left South Africa to receive military training. This was the beginning of a life spent moving between countries' military camps and underground networks. Hani would eventually become one of the most important commanders in the liberation movement. But his journey wasn't smooth. Far from it. One of the lesser known chapters of Hani's life was his involvement in the armed struggle outside South Africa. In the late 1960s, Hani became involved in the Wing campaign, ANC fighters and their alliance attempt to infiltrate South Africa through what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. The mission was dangerous. The fighters were operating deep inside hostile territory. They faced Rhodesia security forces and struggled with inadequate supplies and difficult terrain. Hani later recalled the harsh conditions of military training and operations. This wasn't the glorious revolution sometimes portrayed in political mythology. There was hunger, there were arrests, there were death, there were failures, and there were disagreements. Hani was becoming increasingly convinced that the liberation movement needed to be more effective, more disciplined, and more connected to ordinary South Africans. Those frustrations eventually contributed to one of the most controversial episodes of his political career.
Every revolution has got its traitors. And because they have the resources. They don't mind what happens to the person next door. They are championing their own self-interest. Mercedes Benz, their palaces, they don't care about
In 1969, Hani and several others members of the ANC's military structures became associated with what became known as the Hani Memorandum. The document criticized serious weaknesses within the liberation movement. It raised concern about leadership, military strategy, discipline, and conditions experienced by cadets. This is one of the parts of Hani's story that is often forgotten. Chris Hani wasn't simply a loyal soldier who followed orders. He could challenge his own movement. He could be fearless critically, and he believed the liberation struggle had to confront its own failures. The controversy surrounding the memorandum led to serious political tensions, but after the ANC's Morogoro conference, the signatories were ultimately allowed back into the movement. Hani survived the political storm and his influence continued to grow. In 1974, Hani secretly returned to South Africa. He crossed from Botswana and entered the country on foot. His mission was to help establish underground structures, but remaining in South Africa was becoming increasingly dangerous. He eventually moved to Lesotho. For years, he helped organize underground ANC and MK structure operating against apartheid, and the South African security apparatus knew exactly who he was. By the early 1980s, Hani had become a major target. There were assassination attempts. In one attempt in 1982, a car bombed intended for him exploded prematurely. Hani survived, but the message was unmistakable. Someone wanted him dead. On 9 December 1982, South African security forces conducted a raid in Maseru, Lesotho. The operation targeted ANC structures. Hani was fortunate he wasn't home, but many others were killed. The raid demonstrated something Hani already understood. The apartheid state was prepared to pursue its enemies beyond South Africa's borders. For Hani, a struggle wasn't theoretical. People around him were being killed. His commanders were being hunted, and his own life was constantly under threat. Yet instead of disappearing from public life, his profile continued to rise.
When we established ourselves in Lesotho and were able to set up the underground and military units inside the country and began to operate, South Africa became nervous. They decided to eliminate me in 1981 by sending an agent to plant a bomb under my car. That attempt was abortive. Then they made 2 other attempts to get me killed. In 81, rather than 82 or 81, I'm not sure, they sent units of the SADF to go and kill as many of our people inside the suit, including refugees. Because their intelligence was faulty, they thought that I was in the country. They tried to attack the flat where I used to stay. But just a flat away from my own, they attacked, convinced that I was in that flat, and killed the locals. So this was a measure of desperation. It was not only in Lesotho. They went across Mozambique and killed refugees, and a few of our comrades, they went into Botswana. They were crazy. They decided that they were going to take off their gloves and that they were going to kill anybody who harbored us, who was unfortunate to stay next to us, whether he was a Mosotho, a Motswana, a Zimbabwean. That was the nature of the frenzy existing in Pretoria. It makes me actually realize, you see, with impatience, the need to defeat, this regime. And I don't mince my words when I'm speaking about this regime. I hate it intensely. I hate it. Every time I stand on a platform, I'm reminded of these gruesome atrocities. I'm even reminded of my own children. If they had succeeded, they would have killed. My children were, at that time, one of them was 2 years old, another one 10 years, a baby. And I saw it as basically an inhuman regime, a cruel regime. People who were fighting for a right to oppress the majority of the people of this country. And I disagree with a lot of people who think that de Klerk and others have changed. Because de Klerk and others have done nothing about removing the forces that they created. It's not just Hammer, Van der Vestes, and Gert, Hugo, or whatever his name. It is those people who strategize and worked out the strategies and tactics of destroying us. De Klerk, Rolf Meyer, Adrian Flock, Magnus Malan, Big Potter, who were in the center of the strategy of killing people, in the State Security Council. And therefore, that's why some of us have got reservation about the amnesty they are talking about. Before you consider an amnesty, let us see what they did. When we were coming back, they wanted us, they forced us to fill forms to say, what did we do? And I think that should apply to them as well.
Hani eventually became chief of staff of Umkhonto weSizwe, but something about him made him different from many senior political figures. He had an ability to connect with ordinary people. He wasn't perceived simply as a distant commander. To many young black South Africans, Hani represented something powerful. The possibility of a leader who understood their anger. His military background gave him credibility. His communist politicals gave him an unpromising ideological position. And his personal charisma made him enormously popular. But by the late 1980s, the early 1990s, Chris Hani had become one of the most recognizable figures in the liberation movement. And then something unexpectedly happened. Apartheid began to negotiate with its enemies. In February 1999, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison. The ANC was unbanned. Communist Party was legalized. The country entered negotiations. The armed struggle was moving towards political settlement, and Hani faced a difficult question. What happens to a revolutionary when the revolution begins negotiating?
And I find myself making a long speech. You will pardon me because I think I'm overwhelmed by my coming back. Yeah. I was born here. I grew up here. I was born in Kofimvaba. I love it.
In 1992, Hani relinquished his position as MK Chief of Staff. He increasingly focused on the South African Communist Party, and his popularity continued to grow. For many people, Hani represented a more radical version of most apartheid South Africans. Not mainly political freedom, but economic transformation, social equality, and an end to the extreme inequality created by apartheid. That popularity made him enormously important, but it also made him dangerous to those who feared what a democratic South African might become. Saturday, 10 April 1993, Chris Hani returned to his home in Don Park, Boksburg. His daughter Nomakwezi was with him. Waiting nearby was a man named Walus. Walus was a Polish immigrant and anti-communist. He had obtained a firearm from Conservative Party MP Clive Derby Lewis. According to the historical recordings, Lewis approached Hani at his home. Hani was shot. He died in his driveway. He was only 50 years old. The man who had survived underground warfare, military campaigns, arrests, bombs attacks, and years of apartheid repression was dead, assassinated at his own home. The assassination didn't simply kill a political leader. It created a political earthquake.
I think people should remember Chris for what he said 2 days ago on television. He was at pains to describe stability, peace, cooperation, and even said he doesn't want to be polemical, we must be constructive. That is the Chris Hani who has now becoming dangerous in this country because he's talking peace. People wanted all the time the image of chief of staff to remain on him so that he must be a man of war betrayed forever. But Chris died for peace.
I think
How shall we convince people about peace?
Okay.
In the past, there have been a number of attempts to kill Comrade Chris. In Lesotho, a bomb was placed under his car. Apart from that, when the SADF conducted a raid there in 1982, one of their prime targets was Comrade Chris. Unfortunately, he was out of town on the day the raid happened, and he had also moved house. And when we came back into the country, there was an attempt on his life in 1992, about July of that year.
Janusz Walusz and Clive Derby-Lewis are in prison for life for Chris Hani murder. This coming week, they will plead with the TRC for amnesty.
South Africa was already experiencing numerous violence. Communities were fighting, political organizations were clashing, right-wing groups were resisting the transaction, and millions of people were angry. Then Chris Hani was murdered. The country equipped. There were fears that South Africa could descend into civil war. Nelson Mandela understood the danger immediately. He addressed the nation. His message was not revenge. It was restraint. Mandela called on South Africans to mourn peacefully, protect the country's fragile democratic transition. The assassination had brought South Africa frighteningly close to the edge, and yet something extraordinary happened. Instead of destroying the transaction, Hani's death became one of the moments that pushed the country towards its democratic election. This is where the story becomes complicated. John Hughes Wallace was arrested shortly after the assassination. Clive Derby-Lewis was also implicated. Both were eventually convicted and sentenced to death. Their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment after the death penalty was abolished. But questions surrounding the assassination continued. Were Wallace and Derby-Lewis acting alone? Were there wider networks? Who knew what? And was there a larger political conspiracy? These questions have generated decades of speculation. There is an important distinction between documented evidence and theories. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission later considered applications for amnesty from Wallace and Derby-Lewis. The amnesty application was refused because the committee found that they had failed to make the full disclosure required for amnesty. The historical record identifies the assassination as the work of right-wing extremists, while questions about the wider circumstances have continued to attract debate. So the mystery surrounding Chris Hani's death should not be turned into fact without evidence. But one thing is beyond dispute: his assassination was politically devastating.
Tina,
is another question that has fascinated South Africans for decades. What if Chris Hani had lived? We can never know. Would he have become president? Would he have challenged the direction of the ANC? Would South Africa's economic politics have looked different? Would the relationship between the ANC and the Communist Party have changed? Would he have become a national leader after Mandela? There are no certain answers. History doesn't give us alternate timelines, but what we do know is that Hani was only 50 years old when he died. His political career was still developing and his influence was numerous. His death removed one of the most charismatic and potential consequential figure from South Africa's transition at precisely the moment when the country's future was being decided. Chris Hani's legacy is complicated. He was a Christian, communist, a soldier, political organizer, a revolutionary, husband, father, a scholar, and ultimately a symbol. He believed deeply in inequality. He believed apartheid had to be destroyed. And he was willing to sacrifice his own freedom and eventually his life for the cause he believed in. But perhaps the most important lesson from his life isn't simply that Chris Hani died. It is that he lived through most every major phase of South Africa's liberation struggle. He experienced underground politics, military struggle, exile, internal conflict, political negotiation, and finally the fragile death of democracy. He was a product of apartheid, but he was also one of the people who helped destroy it. On 10 April 1993, a gunman believed he could change South Africa by killing one man. He was right, but perhaps not in the way he imagined. Chris Hani's death could have pushed South Africa into civil war. Instead, it became one of the moments that exposed just how close the country was to disaster and how much depended on ordinary people choosing not to surrender to hatred. 1 year later, millions of South Africans would stand in queues to vote in the South Africa's first democratic election. Chris Hani would not be there. He would never see the South Africa he had fought for, but his name would remain on hospitals, on streets, in political movements, in the memories of those who knew him, and in the history of a country that came frighteningly close to closing its future. Chris Hani was not simply a man who was assassinated. He was a man whose life tells the story of a country fighting to decide what it wanted it to become. And perhaps that is the untold story of Chris Hani, the story of the future South Africa never got to see. Chris Thembisile Hani, born 28 June 1942, died 10 April 1993. His life was taken before he could see the freedom he helped create.